Welcome everyone to the 2017 Castle Lecture. As many of you know, this is the signature lecture series for the EP&E major, Ethics, Politics, and Economics. And this was established thanks to the largesse of John Castle, who, after whom this was named. He'll be here with us tomorrow, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the origin of his gift. But the main event is our speaker, Professor Kathryn Sikkink from the Harvard Kennedy School. The purpose of this lecture is to help us think as a community about the importance of ethical choices that societies and individuals make in this complex world. And we have someone with us today who, in her own work, has thought about these questions for a couple of decades now. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about her work. She's the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Carol K. Pforzheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And she is really the scholar who has had the most to say, I think, about what you would call social entrepreneurship, about the importance of changing the way people, average, ordinary people, think about ethically important questions as a way to move our governments to behave in a way that they otherwise might not. And so she's going to give 3 lectures, today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. I hope you can come to all of them, in sort of extending her thinking about ethics in public life across a range of issues. And so I'll just turn the floor over to Kathryn because she has so much to say, and I hope you will come back tomorrow and the next day as well.
Well, first, thank you, Frances, and thanks to the Castle Lecture Committee, which I presume there's a lecture committee for this great honor. It's actually a great honor to be chosen to give these lectures. And thanks to all of you for being here as well. And in these, I'm using these lectures as an opportunity really to think about an entirely new project. And it's a project, as I call, about rediscovering individual responsibility in the age of rights. And I actually came upon this topic almost by accident in doing the research for my last book that just came out. And as I dug into it, I discovered that it was more important and more controversial than I originally understood. And it was important because the topic of rights and responsibilities helps us think about some of the most pressing political issues of the day, as well as crucial debates on campus. So issues about climate change, gun violence, our civic duty to vote, the right to free speech, including protest, as well as responsibility to respect the speech of others. And I am going to argue that people who work on human rights and people who write about human rights have long avoided using the language of responsibilities, individual responsibilities, and even more the language of individual duties. And now I include myself in that group. Okay, I've been working off and on in human rights for about 37 years. And I've written a lot about the topic, and if you read what I've written, you'll see that I have not written about responsibility, very little about responsibility, and almost nothing about duty. And I have lots of company, okay? Even contemporary thinkers who are sympathetic to cosmopolitan ethics express skepticism about individualized obligations to promote human rights. So philosophers, and I'm not sure we have any philosophers in the audience, but philosophers and political theorists, of course, have dealt with this topic, okay, and have thought, I think, deeply about responsibilities and duties. But the folks who work more on human rights law, and particularly who work on the politics of human rights and human rights practice, have tended to avoid discussions of individual responsibilities and duties. So much so that I would say some writers and activists are so focused on rights that they sometimes bend over backwards to frame everything using a rights language rather than speak of responsibilities. And I'm going to be talking today partly about environmental issues. Environmental activists are increasingly talking about rights as a way to frame the environment. Okay? Our right to a clean environment, the right of trees. I know that sounds, but there's a famous law review article that's been extremely well cited about the right of trees, the rights of rivers, the rights of Earth Mother herself. In Latin America, in Bolivia and Ecuador, there's called the law of Pachamama. That's the Quechua name for the Earth Mother, right? And so there's all these ways of thinking about rights and the environment. And so an environmental group brought a recent loss group in Colorado to give the Colorado River legal rights. If they succeed, the Colorado River will join a small handful of other rivers that have legal rights, including the Ganges River. Now, I am not opposed to rivers, trees, or the Earth Mother herself having rights. But I think it's more practical and straightforward to stress directly the responsibility of states, corporations, and individuals to protect trees, rivers, or the environment more generally. So my purpose here is not to argue against rights. People who know me know that I have long been a firm defender of rights. But I am doing something new, and I'm doing something new for me, and even something risky for me, and that is I want to talk about how we need to bring responsibilities more firmly back into discussions around rights. And so it's not the either-or model, it's not either rights or responsibilities, it's the both rights and responsibilities. Now, this is not only for progressives. Conservatives also often place too much of a stress on rights, such as the right to bear arms, such as the right to religion, but not on the individual duties and responsibilities that must accompany such rights. So that guns do not endanger our society in the way we just saw in Las Vegas, or that the right to religion doesn't lead to discrimination and violence. So let me just briefly sketch how I want to handle this issue over 3 days. I'm thinking of it as 3 concentric circles. The first circle starts with the broadest type of rights and responsibilities to the global order. So issues like climate change or environmental change are genuinely global problems and require global responsibilities. That's kind of today. Tomorrow I'm going to go down to the next circle, which I'm going to think more about civic rights and responsibilities within the nation state. And particularly, I want to talk about the civic responsibility to vote. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to come down further and talk about issues that are very big issues on our campuses today. And certainly they are at Harvard. I know they are here at Yale. Those are national and international issues as well, but I want to think a little about them as campus issues and the issues of the right to speech, the right to protest, and also the responsibility, if not to respect the speech of others, at least not to drown it out. In these talks, I'm going to use the human rights term broadly to refer to economic, social, political, and civil rights that are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the rights, new rights, like the right to a clean environment. And there's unlimited responsibilities we could talk about, and my discussion of responsibilities is geared to rights. So I'm interested in those responsibilities that are essential and are linked to the fulfillment of rights. Now, I argue that human rights people have largely ceded or relinquished the discussion about responsibility, individual responsibility, mainly to others, and I think mainly to conservatives. In part, when we speak of responsibility, it used to be responsibility for others. And now there's been a turn in the way we talk in this country about responsibility, and it's increasingly become responsibility as there's a new book, Yascha Mounk, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, Yascha Mounk, has reminded us, he has a new book called The Age of Responsibility. And he has said that today when we talk about responsibility, we're mainly focused on an individual responsibility for him or herself in the context of a constricting welfare state. Okay, so Monk says we've transformed from responsibility being what you do for others to being what you should do for yourself. But that is a more punitive and I think a narrow understanding of responsibility. I believe that responsibility has the potential to provoke a far richer debate that's intensely relevant for human rights. And it's this richer debate of responsibilities that I want to explore with you over the next few days. So Monk has argued that in the last 30 years, quote, the notion of personal responsibility has become central to our moral and political discourse and to our actual public policies. It's no exaggeration, he argues, to say that we now live in an age of responsibility. But if we take at least a quick and dirty view, using a Google Ngram view of responsibilities compared to rights and duties, I don't know if you can all see, rights are the green line, duties the blue, responsibilities. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the Google Ngram. This is the appearance of certain words, certain phrases and words in books, okay, over a long period of time. But what we see is that compared to rights talk, responsibility and duty talk is still much more limited. And so I'm not convinced yet that we're in an age of responsibility, at least with reference to rights. And that's why I've entitled this Rediscovering Responsibility in the Age of Rights. I'd argue we're in the age of rights. And even if we do, this is, if we take, if you take two words here, human rights and personal responsibility, you find that, they were kind of linked together until 1940. And at least using the double word here in Ngrams, we do not see a dramatic increase in notions of personal responsibility. Now, it would be useful to find other measures of this, and I hope to do that in the future. So this is just kind of a quick and dirty starting place. But I think it's an interesting place to start, and I'll be interested in hearing from you what would be other good ways that one could measure discourses of rights and duties. But for the time being, I'm not yet seeing evidence that we live in an age of responsibilities, but I do agree with Monk that we need to reclaim and find a positive view of responsibility. Monk has done this as a political theorist in the context of U.S. debate over welfare policy. I try to do it as a working social scientist who does work on broader human rights debates. On the issue of responsibility, I've been very influenced by Hannah Arendt's understanding of political responsibility, especially in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. And the parts of that book that have always most captivated me are not the ones about guilt. They're the ones about positive responsibility, and particularly her stories about the importance of the Danish case, of the Danish government and Danish citizens who took political responsibility for the rescue of Jews in Denmark and protected the great, great majority of the Jews in Denmark from deportation to death camps. At one point, Arendt said she thinks that the Danish case should be required reading for every political scientist to talk about the great power of nonviolent resistance and political responsibility. And I agree with her, and in fact, for many years, I made it required reading for any political scientist who took my human rights class. But today, I also have been very, very influenced, since I agreed to this, I'm very influenced by Iris Marion Young's book, Responsibility for Justice. And in particular, she has a notion she calls a social connection model of responsibilities, whereby everyone who is connected to a problem, not just people who are liable for it, who are to blame for it, but people are connected to it and are able to act, need to step forward and take action to work in concert to solve problems of structural injustice. Now, today I want to present what I call some puzzles and some paradoxes about responsibilities. And the first puzzle I call the mystery of the missing duties. In April of 1948, 21 states of the Americas gathered together in Bogota, Colombia, and they produced the first intergovernmental Declaration of Rights, the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man. Notion, the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man. Okay, the whole thing. This, as the title indicates, this provided a clear place for putting duties, individual duties, right alongside rights. But those duties did not get incorporated into later human rights law. And so that's my mystery. What happened to the duties that were present in the American Declaration? Why didn't they go into later human rights law? Now, the American Declaration, it really should be called the Latin American Declaration. There were 20 Latin American countries and the United States. The United States did not participate actively in the drafting of the American Declaration. Everyone thinks that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the first intergovernmental Declaration of Rights, but of the first intergovernmental declaration of the international protection of human rights. But it's not. The American Declaration was drafted, circulated, and approved a full 8 months before the Universal Declaration. Anyone who wants to go into the deep history, we can talk about it, but basically the full draft of the American Declaration was circulated among the countries of the region before the group that drafted the Universal Declaration had its first meeting. Okay, so this truly was the first intergovernmental declaration, and yet Latin Americans never give credit for it. Not only that, my colleagues, various colleagues, continue to talk about human rights as something that comes only from the global north and is imposed upon the global south against their will. Okay? And unfortunately, some of the people who make that argument, and sometimes do it in the name of the people of the global south, have ironically not bothered to read the archives from the global south. And especially they haven't bothered to read about the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man. My issue today, though, is not about human rights as cultural imperialism. That's another talk. My issue today is about the duties in the American Declaration. Okay, so the American Declaration has 10 duties. These are just the shortened, the truncated version of those duties. They're each a long article. But the first duty listed in the American Declaration is the duty of the individual to conduct himself in relation to others so that each and every one may fully form and develop his personality. So this provision could be read as a responsibility to respect the rights of others, but in context, it seems to support a more ambitious claim, that of an individual responsibility to ensure the full development of potential that lies in others. Okay, and then you see these are the other duties that are in the American Declaration. Now, the American Declaration has been recognized by scholars, including people like Johannes Morsink and Marianne Glendon, as a really important influence on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But all the rights in the American Declaration go into the Universal Declaration, none of the duties. And so the question is, what happened to the missing duties? So this is what, the Universal Declaration has only one line on duties, and this is it, Article 29. Now, when drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the delegates managed to get duties entirely taken out of the draft document. And they got down to this. And I'll tell you a little later about how they managed to do that. But after duties failed to get into the Universal Declaration, then they did not move into any other piece of human rights law, with the single exception of the African Convention of Human and People's Rights. And so this might be what political scientists call a path-dependent situation. It could just be that once it was in the Universal Declaration, the path was set for how you write human rights declarations and human rights law, and it was not to include individual duties. But I think there's a deeper puzzle here because that I want to explore later. The second puzzle I have for you is that human rights advocates are among the people most motivated, personally motivated, by a strong sense of ethical, political responsibility towards victims of human rights violations. So when you speak to human rights advocates, and I've spoken to many in my lifetime, I've interviewed hundreds of advocates, what gets them up in the morning is not primarily a sense of anger against injustice, though that is also there, but a deep sense of personal responsibility to do something about it. Yet these individual responsibilities, though deeply felt, are mainly not stated. One friend who's now retired, done a lot of work on human rights and democracy, I asked him that question. I asked him about responsibility, and he said this, quote, "Responsibility is like breathing. I felt duty-bound to take action, but I never used the word responsibility. I never had the consciousness to think about it in those terms." He went on to say, and when people are on the fence, you have to lead by example, not by preaching duty. And if I did try, people might say to me, "Who are you to tell me what to do?" So here's a theme that emerges that's going to reappear again in these next couple of days, and that is the discomfort. The discomfort human rights advocates feel when they talk about individual responsibility to others, almost in the aversion to preaching. So scholars have drawn some parallels between human rights and secular religion. In fact, Sam Moyne, who's at the law school here now, has drawn this parallel between the modern human rights movement as a secular religion. Okay, but in this case, we have human rights activists. They're happy to preach the duty of states. They're happy to preach the power of rights and the duty of states, but they do not want to preach about individual responsibility of others, even though they themselves are motivated by such responsibility. And in the 70s and 80s, human rights activists organizations were famous for actually being so committed to their responsibilities that they mistreated their staff. There were, the 40-hour work week didn't exist, no paid vacations. These are people who often were experiencing secondary trauma, but until today, the organizations were not getting them the psychological support that they needed. So we actually have situations where people are sometimes making themselves physically ill by acting on their sense of responsibility. Yet it was still largely unspoken. Now, finally, I want to draw attention to a paradox that I've found. So I've given you two puzzles and now a paradox. And the paradox is this, is that when I draw attention that there's this view of responsibilities that are simultaneously ubiquitous and dangerous. So what do I mean by ubiquitous and dangerous? Many legal scholars, including I suspect some sitting in the room right now, will say to me, duties are not missing at all. When I presented a preliminary version of this paper to my legal colleagues, I got two main messages. One message was I had simply misunderstood. If I had really taken a law degree, I would know that duties are ubiquitous. They are everywhere implied. Every time you say you have a right, it implies a duty, usually a duty of a state, but maybe a duty of an individual. But I was still puzzled. If it's so obvious that all lawyers know it at least, why is it that the states actually felt the need to take duties out of the Universal Declaration? Okay, it didn't make the they didn't make the argument that duties were obvious, but that they were somehow problematic. Okay, and then some of these same legal colleagues, sometimes taking me aside, would say, and besides, it's dangerous to talk about duties. And so there's the paradox in the sense of a kind of an apparently self-contradictory statement. How could duties be everywhere, so present, as to not even be worthy of mentioning and at the same time dangerous? Now, I thought that was a quirk of the scholars I was talking to. But just 2 months ago, I attended a workshop in Norway, and I was talking to a colleague, a lawyer as well, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm preparing a talk for Yale about human rights and human responsibilities." And she didn't miss a beat. She goes, "Well, that's dangerous." I thought, I can't believe I'm an ocean away, and I'm hearing this dangerous stuff again. So now I knew. I said, "Why is it dangerous?" So she gave me the answer similar to Monk's answer. It's dangerous because the conservatives have co-opted the language of responsibility, and we can't use it without somehow legitimating that version. But I think it's actually more complicated than that. And these are some of my thoughts about why duties might be seen as dangerous or why at least there might be certain discomfort for human rights people around duties. So when delegates were first drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Charles Malick made an impassioned plea to exclude duties from the Declaration. Okay, Malick was a Lebanese delegate to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Drafting Committee. He was a Maronite Christian. He did his doctorate at Harvard, and one author has called him, quote, an existentialist philosopher turned master diplomat. He was one of the foremost important people involved in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1947, he was responding to a draft of the Universal Declaration, the so-called Secretariat draft, okay, because it had been written in the Secretary's office. And Dr. Malick said, it was, quote, astounding that the first articles of the draft declaration should state that, quote, everyone owes a duty to his state. He questioned whether an individual owed such a duty of loyalty regardless of the characteristics of his state, suggesting that an authoritarian state, for example, was not entitled to any duty or loyalty. Malick argued that it was, quote, precisely because the balance has been tipped against the individual and in favor of society that human rights have been violated. For Malick, speaking of duties was about duties to the state, and duties to the state were old and dangerous, and the idea led to human rights violations, not to improvement. Now, and this is kind of I think in 1947, Malick was right, okay? That just at the moment when the rights of human rights were being declared, the international protection of human rights was being declared for the first time, it didn't make sense to come back to this old language of duties, and especially duties to the state. But we're 70 years later now. And the international protection of rights has grown from those first innovative declarations to a large complex of international human rights law, multiple institutions to enforce that law. Human rights are now one of the dominant moral discourses of our age. The balance that Malick spoke of has been, at least rhetorically, tipped in the favor of rights. In this context, it may make sense to think of tipping the balance again by adding individual responsibilities more explicitly back in the mix. Why? Because the lawyers are correct in saying that responsibilities are obvious, in the sense that it only makes sense to say you have a right if there's a correlative duty or responsibility. The rights movement, however, has fixated on state duty, and now today, but increasingly on the duties of corporations. So the fashionable thing to do nowadays is to work on duties of corporations. But some rights, to be genuinely enjoyed, require network duties by all those connected, and including individuals. And I think we've reached an impasse of sorts on some rights where we need to stress rights and responsibilities to see our way through. Now, Malick wasn't alone. He was supported by the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom, who brought with them an Anglo-American tradition that was simply less sympathetic to duties. Okay, so the U.S. contribution to the debate stressed, quote, the exercise of rights, in the exercise of his rights, everyone is limited by the rights of others. This is, as opposed to the rights and duties tradition of Latin America, this is the rights versus rights tradition, I think the Anglo-American rights versus rights tradition, okay? So individual rights are only limited by the rights of others, not by a duty to respect rights. And I actually think it's particularly this Anglo-American tradition that's gotten out of balance. So I'm arguing that stressing duties as complements to rights could be a tool to address global challenges. We've already talked about the environment, but we could also talk about issues like for example, problems of the refugee issue, right? When we're talking about refugees, it's important not just to talk about the duties of states to receive refugees. It's important also to talk about the duty of communities, the responsibility of communities to help the state receive refugees, and even to talk about responsibilities of refugees to make a life in a new country. If we're talking about confronting economic inequality, it's necessary to talk about the rights of individuals to an adequate standard of living and the duties of individuals to pay taxes so that a government can address poverty and inequality at home and abroad. It's, again, it's become really fashionable, led by our current president, to act that only stupid people pay taxes. The whole notion of a civic responsibility to pay taxes has become démodé. But in a world where all economic and social rights depend on available resource of government, governments say, we don't have available resources. And yet we know that the available resources are there, but are not being tapped for a government policy. And even something like let's say the education of girls and women in the world. It's not enough just to say the state needs to build schools or needs to change its laws. We have to talk responsibility of parents, teachers, schools, communities, and states to create the conditions under which that right can be fulfilled. Okay, so I've already suggested some reasons why duties might be seen as dangerous. I want to just quickly synthesize them in a few bullet points. The perception that conservatives have monopolized the term, right? And many feel that term responsibility has become to be a way of blaming victims for their own misfortunes. And so if human rights people use the term, it inevitably carries that baggage. Monk describes this, he says, in response, the left has come forward with what Monk calls the no responsibility view. Okay? And that is that people who receive welfare, for example, have no responsibility for their position because they couldn't have avoided it. Their situation is so deeply structural, so deeply a result of the structure, be it of capitalism or of our system here, that people should be seen as having no responsibility. Among human rights activists, there's some of this no responsibility thinking with regard to victims. Indeed, that the proper attitude in human rights is to see the victim as without responsibility. This is so much the case. There's a really interesting debate nowadays where victims don't want to be called victims, because if you're a victim, not only do you not have responsibility, but you don't have agency. And so you have the move where people say, no, we're not victims, we're survivors of torture, of sexual abuse, whatever, because it's a way to maintain their agency in that situation. And I think perhaps also maintain something connected to agency, which is responsibility. But I disagree with Monk that the no responsibility view is somehow more associated with the left. I hear it in the left. I know the left does it. I know the human rights movement does it. But as I suggested earlier, I think the right is doing it every bit as much, and that with the example of gun violence being the most prominent, right? So we do not hear, even though gun violence in this country has reached a level of a huge social injustice, we don't hear enough about the duties of owners of guns, the state, the gun industry, gun store owners, and everyone else connected, socially connected to gun violence, of what we're going to do to be able to bring this, to address the situation. But what we know is the language of rights is utterly insufficient by itself to address it. Likewise, when Jack Phillips, the owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado, refused to do a wedding cake for a gay couple there because of his right to religion, he stressed only his right to religion, but not any personal, ethical, or legal responsibility not to discriminate. Once again, all the weight falls on my right, not on my responsibilities. So now, whenever I start talking about this, my colleagues get anxious, right? Because they're saying you're talking too much about individual agency and you're ignoring structural or systemic processes that cause human rights violations, right? And because there's structural causes, we're going to need very powerful responses, and often the notion that only radical change, for example, in the nature of capitalism, is sufficient to address these human rights violations. But that's why I find Iris Young's position so compelling, because instead of a no responsibility view, it proposes a broader and deeper understanding of responsibility, more responsibility, not no responsibility. Okay. Third, I think there's a worry that responsibilities and duties is a way to smuggle in religious sentiment or traditional humanitarian beliefs into the human rights language. So one explanation for why duties didn't go from the American Declaration into the Universal Declaration is that some delegates were worried that the duties in the American Declaration came from Catholic social doctrine, and it was a way of kind of smuggling Catholic social doctrine into the Universal Declaration. Now, I know from the research, the duties in the American Declaration are indeed in part from Catholic social doctrine, okay? But they have two other sources as well. One important source is socialist thought. Okay, so this is back in 48. We have Guatemala under Arevalo, just has a radical new constitution, and they are proposing duties that come out of their socialist vision. The main the main delegate that drafted it was a Mexican delegate, and he took his ideas of duties from the Mexican Constitution of 1917. It was considered a radical constitution at the time. It had a lot of economic and social rights as well as these duties. And it was an anti-clerical government, okay? So this idea that somehow this is only religion misses the boat. And finally, in the Americas, both North and South, there is a civic republican vision that also calls for more attention to responsibilities and duties. Okay, and finally, there's this worry, and I think this is what Malick suggested, that focusing on duties could lead us to take away rights. And this worry has taken a very modern form recently. Again, when I presented this to some legal colleagues, they said, well, what about dignity? I'm like going, dignity? I'm not sure what dignity has to do with responsibilities. And they said, well, what about the dwarf tossing case? Which I didn't know about at the time, but I do know about now. And so there's a relatively obscure case of the Human Rights Committee, the case Wackenham v. France. The so-called dwarf tossing case has taken on importance well beyond its narrow confines, okay? Because it is seen as creating a precedent that states could be permitted to deny rights to individuals because those individuals are not acting in the name of their own responsibility to protect their own dignity. I know that sounds, but so it may sound far-fetched, but listen. Okay, dwarf tossing apparently started in Australia, in bars and discotheques, and it involves contestants who see how far they can throw, and here I quote, a willing and suitably protected dwarf the furthest into a padded landing stage. Okay? Now, New York City prohibited dwarf tossing in 1990. Florida did as well, and so did France. Mr. Wackenham, a French citizen, argued that the law, quote, infringed on his autonomy and his right to pursue employment in a difficult job market. The Human Rights Committee found, however, that it was contrary to his dignity to sell himself into dwarf tossing, and upheld the French law. I'm sure there was some kind of margin of appreciation there too. People are worried about this case because particularly for what it will foreshadow, and I think particularly what it's going to foreshadow about sex work, right? If a dwarf cannot sell himself into tossing, it's not far, some reason, before people will not be permitted as a matter of responsibility for their own dignity to sell themselves into sex work. And so there's this sort of new anxiety as well about responsibility that focuses, I think, on a quite narrow set of issues, which is responsibility one has to oneself and one's own dignity. That's still kind of stirring up the waters here. So what is my response to this list of dangers and discomforts of duties? First, and here for my legal colleagues, I want to say I'm not interested in creating more legal responsibilities. Okay? I'm not arguing we should open up any human rights law and somehow renegotiate it so that we have legal responsibilities. I'm speaking entirely about ethical and political responsibilities. And I'm using political in the tradition of Arendt to think of politics as a process we use of shaping our world. Now, to signal the shift, I'm going to shift now entirely to speak of responsibilities and not of duties for the rest of the lectures. People differ about the precise meaning of duty and responsibility, but some consensus that duty implies a more legal and or precise obligations. Iris Young makes an interesting distinction between responsibility and duty, arguing that responsibility conceptually is more open and discretionary. She says, this is quote, "It is up to the agents who have a responsibility to decide what to do to discharge it within the limits of other moral considerations." And I think that's a very useful and interesting idea that I want to come back to when we talk a little more about climate change. And that is that there's not a single path through which individuals discharge responsibility. So I want to speak here then of turning to Iris Young's model of social responsibility, okay, and her social connection model of responsibility. So Iris Young was a socialist feminist theorist. Her last work was Responsibility for Justice, the one I'm using. It was actually not quite finished when she died and was finished by a colleague and published. It has been seen in different ways. Some people see it as totally moving away from her previous work, but others see it as a practical application of her more theoretical ideas and a movement from critique to reform or to some concrete proposals for change. Now she does a couple things. One is she said when people think of responsibility, they almost always think of the liability model of responsibility. They think of the legal model. They think of blame. Who is to blame? Who is at fault? Who can be sued? Or who can be put in prison for it? And she says, in this particular case, I'm not mainly interested in the liability model. And like Young, I do not believe that we should replace or reject the liability model. I wrote a whole book 2 books ago called The Justice Cascade, where I talked about the importance of individual criminal accountability for mass atrocity. I believe it's entirely important and appropriate to keep a whole area of human rights where we have individual criminal accountability for gross violations of human rights. But I believe that there are a whole set of human rights issues where the liability model doesn't get us very far. Or individual criminal accountability may be only one small part of the solution, and instead we need to look at this social connection model. It's funny because before I encountered the social connection model, I'd written my first article on duties. I'd written it with a co-author, Fernando Berrión del Valle, who I want to recognize his contributions to my research and my thought on this issue. It came out in the Minnesota Journal of International Law. Anyone who's interested in a long, somewhat dry, but very well footnoted article about the deep history of duties in human rights law, as well as in constitutions. We do a quantitative count of how, where and how what duties appear in constitutions in what countries and regions of the world. It's not surprising that the region of the world with most duties in their constitutions is also Latin America. But in any case, I wanted to say I brought some off-print. Some people are interested. You can help yourself to the off-print over there. So we had already used this phrase. We called it network duties. And it was getting at some of the same kinds of issues as the social connection model. And that is that everyone connected is going to have to step forward. I prefer now Young's notion of a social connection model. And that's the one I'm now going. That's the language I'm going to use, but it's quite similar to something I think Fernando and I were sort of stumbling towards with our networked models of responsibility. Okay, so the dilemma again when I start advocating this social connection model, people say, yeah, but if individuals get involved, it's going to let the state get off the hook. And the state will not take responsibility for what it needs to do because individuals are stepping forward. And I, again, want to just tell a little story because this took me back to many years ago when I had a Latin American friend visiting me in Minnesota. We were driving on the road and we saw one of those ubiquitous signs, you know, the Rotary Club is responsible for cleaning off keeping clean the roadside for the next 2 miles. And my friend said, I hate those signs. I hate the whole concept because those people are stepping forward and letting the state off the hook. The state should be doing that. And it's wrong that individuals step forward and take the stake off the hook. And at the time, I mean, we had a big discussion. I thought, like, this is virtually all of the litter in that ditch has been thrown out by individual drivers. I can think of nothing better than having the people from the Rotary Club with their kids in tow on a Saturday morning down there picking up garbage created by individuals. Because at a minimum, those kids, next time, you know, they want to throw a candy wrapper out of the window, they're going to think twice, right? And but this also brought me to a much more recent story that my friend Sue told me from Gloucester. And she said, you know, it used to be that the state, of course, the city of Gloucester put out the receptacles on Good Harbor Beach. But the receptacles on a good beach day got really full. But people kept piling in, sitting it all on the sides of the receptacle. And ultimately, you know, the tide came in and all that junk went out because they couldn't put it all in the receptacles. So the city of Gloucester said, we're just not putting receptacles on the beach anymore. People are going to, who pack in their garbage are going to have to pack out their garbage. And the beach got a lot cleaner. The point I want to make with this is that sometimes this tension between state responsibility and individual responsibility is not so simple. And there may be some efficacies to getting individuals involved in responsibility for themselves, right? That it doesn't, or we shouldn't always assume the state will do everything. So my answer is that sometimes we need to be simultaneously concerned about state and individual responsibility for ethical reasons, but also for the sometimes surprising and counterintuitive efficacy that a determined assertion of individual responsibility can have. Now, I'm going to end with just a few remarks about climate change and how my model relates to climate change. There's a huge literature on climate ethics. I can't even begin to scratch the surface. But some of that literature is actually drawing on something quite similar to Iris Young's idea of a social connection model of responsibility. So Young believes that we have political responsibility not primarily by way of our membership in a community. That's what Arendt said. Young says, no, it has to go beyond just being a member of a political community. It has to be based on your actual acts, your deeds. Deeds matter. And responsibility is a matter of what we have and have not done. So, for example, in the area of climate change, it calls upon us to ask not just what has the state done, what have corporations done, but also what have we done? What have our deeds done with regard to climate change? And some authors believe that if many more of us did this over the course of a lifetime, personal emissions reductions in themselves could be substantial. In addition to their actual impact, working on and talking about a responsibility to reduce our personal emissions could have communicative value that increases their efficacy. So the crucial issue is that this individual responsibility must be exercised in a collective manner, right? It's not enough for us to work in isolation. We have to also work with others to try to effect an overall emission reduction. Our primary responsibility is both thus to take action individually and to make sure our individual action is connected to broader efforts to organize collectively. And virtually every author on this topic acknowledges individuals have some duty to promote collective action on the environment. So in this case, we have to ask ourselves hard questions about how to reduce our carbon footprint and how to organize collectively. And particularly at this moment in our history, at this moment when our federal government has stepped back out of taking any responsibility for climate change. It may be a very important moment where, as we know, municipal governments and state governments and individuals and other communities are stepping forward to see what they can do to exercise their responsibility in this context of the federal state avoiding its responsibility. And here, Iris Young's point that responsibility is more open and discretionary is useful. There's not one way we need to fulfill our climate responsibility. There are multiple paths available to us. My own path is whenever I teach global citizenship, I have my students and I do our carbon footprint. Have you ever done this in class? If you're a faculty member, you have to do it with your students. And your students, of course, come in. Most students have incredibly small footprints, you know. And then so I come in and I calculate everything I'm doing. You know, I live in a small house near work. I've added solar panels. I'm turning down the temperature. I'm no longer eating beef. I'm composting. I'm recycling. I'm walking and biking. But then I add in my international and domestic airfare. And my footprint goes crazy, you know. And basically, you know, a single international air travel wipes out everything I can do with composting and a lot of my other efforts in a year. So my own personal struggle is with international and domestic airfare. And that gets ridiculed sometimes. Someone invited me to Hong Kong. I've never been to Hong Kong. I do international relations. I've never been to China. I think I should go to China. But I'm thinking, this is crazy. You know, you fly across the world just because, not because I have a real research agenda there, but just because as an international relations scholar, I should go to China. And so I'm kind of agonizing about it with my colleague in Hong Kong, and you know, who writes back and sort of says, you know, get a life. He said, you know, so this is some kind of endowed lecture. He says, if you don't come, we'll invite somebody else. So someone will take the flight. And he goes, you should just, you know, get that electric car, you know, you Americans, I think, should just get that electric car underway or impeach your president. So, you know, but again, he wants to say, you know, in some ways, he's sort of ridiculing the notion that there are individual responsibilities. And of course, we need to get the electric car underway, right? And of course, we need to do something about our federal government not doing its responsibility with climate change. But that doesn't mean that we all shouldn't be grappling also with individual responsibilities. So just to conclude, I'm arguing that the world of human rights, which is a world in which I've devoted much of my scholarship and my advocacy, the language of individual responsibilities continues to be missing in an important way. And at this moment, a moment when human rights discourses are both more powerful than ever before and yet more under attack than ever before, this balance of rights, this yin-yang of rights and responsibilities has gotten out of balance. And we who believe in rights, we who think human rights comes as close as we can come to a universal moral vocabulary and legal system capable of addressing repression and injustice, we need to call responsibility explicitly back into our world of rights to bring that world back into balance. But exactly how and why to do this and how it should be framed is what I want to invite you to discuss with me, actually ask you to think out loud with me over these next 3 days, starting now with your comments and questions. There are risks and discomforts, perhaps even some dangers, but in the current context, the risks of inaction and complacency are often more pressing than the risks of learning how to balance responsibilities as crucial complements to rights. Thank you. Okay, so I know we have a group of people who have to leave, so who told me ahead of time. But I'm serious. I want people to help me think out loud about this. This is, as you know, these Castle lectures get turned into books, and I really would appreciate any comments and suggestions or challenges you have for me. Yeah, Ona?
So just an opening question to get things going, and just a clarification to some degree. So part of the reason that we focused primarily on rights language in the human rights world is that a lot of, at least the rights that were covered in the Universal Declaration and the early treaties were really negative rights as against the state. And that was partially a Western U.S. agenda. You know, there was this, which you describe a bit, the kind of negative rights versus positive rights view, and that the international community largely kind of got going on the negative rights view. And there it makes sense to focus on rights as opposed to responsibility, because you have the right not to be tortured. You know, to talk about responsibility in the context of torture it kind of seems dissonant, right? It doesn't seem kind of how you would fit that in, other than to fit it into state responsibility, right? It's the responsibility of the state not to engage in torture. And there are, of course, the draft articles on state responsibility, which is all about the ways in which the state is responsible. So you're right to say there's a language about responsibility that's largely focused on the state. And whether in some ways what you're reacting to or you're speaking to, in some ways this is a question less and a comment, seems to be kind of a move towards a different category of topics. So you're now talking about climate change. Well, that's kind of different from, say, torture or crimes against humanity or war crimes, the kinds of things where the state, you know, it's about what the state is doing to me, and I have the right to tell the state not to do that thing to me. Climate change is very different because, of course, yes, there's obviously a role for the state, but the state has to act by controlling the behavior of individuals. And so the state, of course, there's some climate change control that can happen through controlling the actions of the state, but a lot of it is about how do you control the action of the individual. So all of a sudden now, you can't really tackle the problem without talking about individuals and responsibilities of individuals. So is the conversation you're calling for not so much like we messed up by failing to talk about individual responsibilities in the human rights world, but that we're now tackling a different set of problems for which simply talking about rights isn't enough, because you're not going to get anywhere just talking about rights and just talking about the state. You've got to start talking about getting individuals involved and taking responsibility for action. So I guess I'm just trying to clarify, it's not so much you're arguing against that the human rights world, yourself included, was wrong, but that we're now in a different category, or we're talking about different kinds of things such that we have to now bring in language of responsibility. So it's more of a clarifying question, I think.
Yes, no, I'm not saying that the human rights movement messed up, which is actually why I said I thought Malick in 1947 was right, that we should stress rights and not duties to the state. Okay, but then I said it's 70 years later. Okay, and yes, there are some issues, and I think climate change is a good example, was actually why I started there, where the possibility of multiple actors being connected to a problem and the necessity of them taking action and their ability to take action without the state, even if the state has retreated, is very high. Okay, so we know actually that you know what California does is like really important for climate change, and so yes, there are some issues where that's more obvious. Having said that, it's not your kind of classic. So what are some of the issues I'm going to talk about tomorrow? I'm going to talk about the responsibility to vote, right? And again, we've heard a lot about how we need to struggle against voter suppression, struggle against the state, and I believe we need to struggle against voter suppression. But the truth is, we have a bigger problem with non-participation than we even have with voter suppression. And I'm going to talk about that. Or, you know, I'm going to talk about speech. You know, the right to speech, okay, there is some suppression of speech, but we have this issue on campus, right, is how do we exercise our right to speech, how do we protest, and yet still exercise responsibility for at least not blocking the speech of others. Yeah, I promised.
Hi, so I'm a human rights lawyer from the UK, specialising largely in the rights of migrant and refugee children.
A little louder, please.
Sorry?
A little louder.
So UK human rights lawyer specialising in refugee and migrant children's rights. I wondered if you'd looked at children's rights law, legal discourse around children's rights, particularly around, you know, I mean, one of the things is that we found in practice is, you know, acting in the best interest of the child. Most lawyers haven't got a clue what that means. So what does acting in the best interest mean? I mean, now we've had movement, we've been moving on this, and there's now been the UNCRC General Comment 14 on what best interest means, and it's about the responsibilities of schools. You know, if we're looking at best interests, we're also having to consider the development and well-being of the child, and therefore there is this, I think, a sense of the need to think about who are the professionals but also the actors in the child's life. So I just wondered if you had looked.
Right. No, one, it's a terrific point, and I have looked at it, and I'd like you to send me the general comment you just mentioned. So the notion of children appears very early. You see that duties to children and parents appear in the American Declaration, also in the African Convention, okay? And they come out of the Mexican Constitution. So here you're in this revolutionary Mexican Constitution, and the first duties it talks about and goes on at length is about the duty to education and the duty to educate your children. And the duty of parents, for example, not just the duty of the state. The duty of the state, the duty of parents to educate their children. And then the American Declaration has this interesting thing. You have a duty to educate yourself. So it's not, sometimes the duties are actually not just the parents and the state and the school and the community, but actually children have responsibilities. And adults too, as you know, may have responsibilities. We may think of responsibilities for learning. So I completely agree that children would be a particularly a special case where people honed in very early on responsibilities. Yes, and the purpose.
About the links between theories of distributive justice and human rights law. So I was struck by your interaction with the Norwegian human rights advocate who sort of was afraid of responsibility because she thought it was a conservative idea, but I thought of sort of Dworkin, J. Cohen, John Romer's idea of sort of appropriating the anti-egalitarian rights conception of responsibility in service of a leftist case for redistribution. And so my question is, should duties be conceived of differently when speaking of economic rights than with sort of social or political rights? Because also looking back at the American Declaration of the Rights of Man and Duties of Man that you sort of put up, I was sort of struck to see that duties with respect to social security and welfare and also the duty to work were included. Yeah.
I'm sitting here trying to find something that works because I actually wanted to put yes, good. I wanted to put my email address up here because you just mentioned an author I'm not familiar with. So I'm going to ask people when you give me ideas to actually send them to me, if you don't mind. Okay. At hks.harvard.edu.
Who was it? Cohen, Romer,
Cohen,
and
Dworkin, and John Romer.
Okay, you know these people, Dworkin.
Yeah, I know Dworkin, but I don't know this particular piece. So I don't know the particular piece you mentioned. So yes, it's particularly important in the area of economic social rights. And so I have been thinking quite a lot about what I said. As you know, the Covenant on Civil and Political, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights talks about available resources, right? Governments, throw up their hands. And yet, we know that there's all sorts of ways that available resources are there and are being sucked out of countries via corruption, via illicit financial flows, tax havens, tax evasion, tax avoidance, etc. Okay, so it turns out that we need actually quite complex responsibilities to try to figure out how to capture some of those resources to bring them back into the provision of state services that can contribute to economic and social rights. And I'm interested in pursuing these issues of what kinds of policies could be taken to deal with distributive justice. Yes. Yes.
Take my friend. Thank you for that talk. The reason I came actually was because I wanted to hear. I've so rarely heard any talk about responsibilities at Yale or at any other university. It's very refreshing to hear somebody from Harvard.
I've only been there 4 years, so.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a step in the right direction. You've spoken about responsibilities. It seems, in some way, I think it's a very good thing to raise this issue again, at least in part to remind all these people on the left that rights come with responsibilities. It's not just a way of blaming the victim, but people actually do have responsibilities. But I don't think you've gone far enough today. Maybe you will a bit more in the second and third talks, because I'm interested in what you're going to say about campus life, you indicated in the third. It does seem to me responsibility is first fundamentally a trait of character. It's a virtue of character, as it were. was trying to think about how to think about that. It's fundamentally, in some ways, taking, as we might say, kind of ownership for your life and your choice, the kind of choices that you make, the kind of life that you choose to live. It assumes choice. This language of structural conditions seems to me to be, I know this is very unsocial sciencey to say this, but it seems to be a way of denying people choice and responsibility for their choices. Mm-hmm. But I didn't hear much from you about this dimension of responsibility as a trait of character that is connected with rights, mm-hmm. but that to be worthy of rights, it means that you have to be a certain kind of person. It means you have to display certain kinds of character traits. I know that is a very bourgeois idea, but it does seem to me, if you want to talk about responsibilities, you're going to have to end up sort of rehabilitating some of these kind of bourgeois notions of individualism and the right and the responsibility for your choices and actions in life.
Right. So I do believe that responsibilities may be related to character. Having said that, your kind of second to last sentence is exactly the sentence that's going to put the human rights people against the move to responsibility. Okay, because your rights are part of what you have by virtue of being human, not by virtue of your character, and not by virtue of your deeds. Okay, so that's the dilemma we face. That the human rights community believes, and I share it, that one has rights by virtue of their humanity, not by virtue of having proved themselves worthy of rights. And if I go there where you went, I'm at least to my audience, I destroy my argument. Okay, so we can still talk. I'm just saying we can still talk, but I can't talk in that way that people become worthy of rights via the performance of responsibilities. Okay, but let's talk. I think character is good to talk about. So part of we're saying that this still practicing responsibility and practicing responsibility collectively is a way that I think people do build character, and they maybe help their communities build character, right? Because some of we're going to some of this notion that it's kind of bad manners to talk about responsibilities. This notion of like you shouldn't talk about it. You should lead by example and not talk about it. There's something off-putting. And I think we have to get a little beyond that, this notion that you shouldn't talk about responsibilities. We have to find a way to talk about responsibilities that's not preachy, right? But it has to be more than leading by example. And there's a lot of good there's examples of this. I will say this in 2 days, but young people, for example, have figured out responsibility for drunk driving. A lot of them. They figured out a way of saying, I'm responsible today, I'm not drinking, I'm driving. And guess what? You're responsible tomorrow, because I'm not going to do this not drinking stuff all week. And so and you may not consider that character, but that's character, okay? And that's young people.
Kind of deferred gratification.
Yeah, but that's young people willing to try to instruct their peers about what a good member of the group does. They step forward and they do their share, okay? And so I do think that a more public discussion of responsibilities could be good for helping to build character. And I think we do have to escape from this feeling that you really shouldn't tell people what to do, because it's rude, or it's whatever. Yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I see another kind of tension with human rights, and if you take the idea of the social connection aspect of responsibility farther than you did, at least in the talk today. Mm-hmm. So, I'm a member of a particular ethnic group. I'm a member of a particular church, a particular gender. So I have dense social connections to my church, my ethnic group, my gender, maybe my clan, and so on, right? So if it's a social connection model of responsibility, that suggests that I have more responsibility towards the people with whom I have dense social connections, which I think is actually the way a lot of people live. But there's a tension between that and the universalism of human rights, in which one would think would imply kind of universal duties and responsibilities. So, and climate change puts that in nice perspectives, so that you know, the responsibility around climate change is global, and so that if it's a social connection model, I was struck by the notion of torture. It seems to me that there are particular responsibilities that some people have towards a victim of torture that other people may not have, which isn't to say that the state shouldn't be called out,
right?
You know, for violating the right not to be tortured. So I guess my question is, how far are you going to take this idea of social connection? And I think it fits very well with the idea of networks.
Yeah. So one, I should say that, and I probably didn't explain this well enough, that her notion of social connection is the connection to the problem. We're socially connected to the problem, not necessarily the community. And so she does a brilliant chapter on housing as a structural injustice, as in which many of us are socially connected to the problem, even though nothing we've done makes us kind of how guilty of the modern housing. So, you know, Cambridge, Massachusetts, you know, it's, you know, incredible homelessness because of our housing market, right? And a lot of us are implicated. We're socially connected to it, even though we can't be said, you know, we're to blame for it. And so social connection is about connection to the problem. Everyone's socially connected through the problem, not to the community. Having said that, you've asked a brilliant question, and that is, this conflict between universal responsibilities and individual. And that's kind of why I like Young's notion that responsibility is still discretionary and open-ended. In other words, and so, many of us live lives of responsibility where we do have an inner circle, it's our family, our kids, our parents, where we feel a greater responsibility. And then, you know, and I don't think there's anything in the responsibility model that says, no, you must have equally responsible to all members. In fact, I almost wanted to talk about, in the talk, about the rescuer literature, right? Because the rescuers during World War II especially, but in Rwanda and elsewhere, you know, have this amazing characteristic of having exercised great responsibility at a time it was quite dangerous, right? And so they're kind of models of this responsibility. And yet, if you read Olinger and Kristen Monroe and other people who've written about the rescuers, the children of rescuers are sometimes a little worried about they were worried about what happened because the children were sometimes put at risk. The families, their own children were put at risk. And the children often knew that. They knew that their parents were making no distinction whatsoever between the neighbors who needed help and their children. Okay? And so you might say that they live that life of universal duty, no distinction, but I don't believe that a responsibility model calls upon us to live that life. Okay? And I think it's entirely appropriate with this model that we would see that we might have, what's not appropriate is to see I only have obligations to my community and none other. Right? But not that I might do more for my children or my parents than I'm going to do for, you know, the neighbor next door.
Can I just ask a follow-on?
Yeah.
So if I live in an apartment building in front of which there are a dozen homeless people every day, I have a social connection with them, not just through the general issue of housing and homelessness, but does the model imply that as somebody with that kind of proximity that I have special responsibility?
You know, I don't know, and that's Harvard Square, right? That's what I walk past every morning. The truth is, I've been walking through Harvard Square grappling and saying, what is my responsibility to homelessness in Cambridge? Because I walk past it every day. Yeah. Yes.
So, just two angles. One, on the Iris Young point, I'm puzzled that you don't talk about a central figure in the last generation's political theory, which is John Rawls.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have a coherent notion of obligation at the very center of things. that is to say, you are obligated to view your obligations behind the veil of ignorance. The state is the preeminent form of fulfilling this obligation. California is a state. Right? The United States is a state. The collectivity of states, or states. The aim, says Rawls, is of taking this, veil of ignorance, thin veil of ignorance, and there are lots of other people who are talking about this too. Is to organize the basic structure of society. That is to say, the things that you're just born into, like your genes, who your parents are, how rich they are, the educational system you're in, the initial distribution of wealth, etc. Those are things which if people are going to take responsibility for them in a central way, it's through the state. So when Donald Trump is failing, the most appropriate thing to do is to kick him out. Or not just waste your little time anxiety-fying about 12 people on Harvard Square, but mobilize them so we can kick them out and orient yourself to the only organization that could possibly work to reorganize things in the basic structure. Then, and this is the other side of the absolutely banal central thought, people then should have the right to take responsibility for the meaning of their own lives. And if they want to spend all their time with their families or with their churches, then they have a right to do that. This is called, in the banal language of philosophy, deontological activist liberalism. Now, Iris Young is anti-that. But that debate, rather than just taking one side of it, that debate is the debate, which there are like 45.
Yeah.
There are just and to sort of mush it all together, which is what you were doing. Okay. It seemed to me was puzzling.
One, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not pretending to be a philosopher, and I'm speaking to a very specific audience, which are people who work in the area of human rights and who are activists in the area of human rights, okay? And so my belief is, and this is, I'm sorry, the lawyers do it to me, the philosophers do it to me, okay? Is say, if you are not, yeah.
What are you talking about?
No, but
you're not a philosopher. You are citing a philosopher.
Are you saying that no one who's not a philosopher can cite a philosopher?
No, of course not. But you're taking her as the foundation of your thought.
I'm taking as foundation of thought because when I read that, I was grappling with these issues, and when I read Iris Young, I was illuminated to things. And when I read Hannah Arendt, I was illuminated, and when I read Monk, I was illuminated. These are all philosophers that I found useful. Okay. So Rawls. But I just want to clarify. I don't think one, and this is the problem, if we're going to have the lawyers tell us you can't talk about law because you haven't understood law, which is what these colleagues told me when I first started talking about it. You know, you don't understand that law is ubiquitous, that responsibility is ubiquitous. And if we're going to philosophers tell us that we can't talk about philosophy unless we have become moral philosophers, then we can't have an interdisciplinary discussion. Okay, so Rawls. I don't pretend to be at all an expert of Rawls. I did not go back and reread Rawls. Why? In part because, and I will now, if you suggest it, but in part because for people in the realm of human rights, Rawls has been problematic because of the distinction he drew between our international responsibilities and our domestic responsibilities. And so since anyone working in the realm of the international protection of human rights has already moved, this is the audience I'm addressing, our human rights people, they've already moved to the notion that we have internationally guaranteed rights and we have as a result, international responsibilities derived from those rights. Okay, and I don't want to go back to the philosophical debate about what are our international rights and responsibilities, because I'm taking those as a starting point for my discussion. I'm not trying to establish that.
Well, Rawls does have a book called Law of Peoples.
I know.
Which talks about
international, but which are, and he talks about the great difference between what he would think of as the international rights and responsibilities versus those we have to members of our community. So, yes.
I was really interested. Let me start by saying the discussion about how conservatives view human rights is very new to me, the sort of rights and responsibility question. And I was just interested in trying to think about why your argument about individual responsibility, if I understand it right, wouldn't resonate with conservatives, because it seems to me that the conservative beef tends to come with the state, that the idea of this, writing down every conceivable, putting into law or whatever, with sort of a state focus on, every conceivable individual action. That seems to be part of the problem. And so I'm just curious if you could talk more about whether there is a possibility for some kind of resonance in your argument about finding, you mentioned trying to go beyond just, well, the state needs to do this for me, or my family needs to do this for me. That sort of individual piece in some ways seems to resonate with a conservative idea. So I was just interested in that.
I believe that the issue of responsibilities is something that could lead to a broader argument, a broader discussion among people from diverse political viewpoints. Okay, and so yes, I think that's possible. I don't think it's likely it's going to happen, and it's partly because we hold very strongly these notions, right? We hold, so just as I think Monk said that a lot of leftists have a no responsibility view when it comes to certain kinds of victims, people who have been victims, so the right has apparently a no responsibility view when it comes to the owners of guns. Okay? And so I do think that we're going to need to, in order to have this discussion, we're going to open our minds to re-examining some of our own assumptions about who has rights and who has responsibilities, and whether we should have a realm of no responsibility with regard to rights. Yes?
You cannot be an adult without being responsible. Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm from China, the place you have never been. I'm currently a visiting scholar in China Center of Yale University. I found a very interesting phenomenon, because I'm from China. So in Chinese constitution, many years ago, we emphasized too much the obligations and the duties of the individual, so not so much rights. And later we realized, so now maybe in the constitution we have some obligations and also some rights. We say that maybe it's according to the Marxism or the socialist theory, that they're saying that there's no rights without obligation. There's no obligation without rights. Maybe this is kind of contradictory, but it's in the textbook when I was a student. So I feel this is quite interesting phenomenon. But in the Western society, in human rights protection, it seems that you intentionally ignore the obligation because of certain reason. So I think maybe both sides go to an extreme. Maybe in the future it has to be balanced.
Right.
Rights and obligation should also be emphasized.
Right.
Just my observation.
Yeah. No, that's
quite interesting.
That's partly what I'm saying. But I just would clarify what I'm saying, and that is that, and that's what I said lawyers have said, is that for every right, there needs to be a correlative responsibility or duty, right? Or else rights won't ever be realized. They'll simply be aspirations. But I just want to clarify, and this came up with my other answer, and that is, I'm starting from rights, okay? Because the danger when we start to, for me, the danger, okay, when we start to say there's rights, there's obligations, we need them both. For every, for every right there's an obligation, for every obligation there's a right. It makes them, it doesn't necessarily prioritize rights. And I believe, and the reason I'm engaged in this inquiry, is I believe in the priority of rights, but that we will not be able to help people achieve greater fulfillment of rights unless individuals take, I think, really embrace the idea of greater responsibility. Okay, so I'm not agnostic about what comes first. I believe rights come first, and I believe actually, if we aren't clear that rights come first, that saying no, rights, responsibilities, they both have to be there, they all mix up, it's fine, could be pernicious, because we reach the point where we say that person hasn't done their responsibilities, they don't deserve their rights. And I'm not willing to go there. I'm not willing to go saying that a failure to do responsibility means that you lose all your rights. And so I both agree with you, right, on the importance of both, but I want to have an inflection on being driven by rights.
Mm-hmm. We just have
one more, and here it is, right there.
So I wanted to circle back to your specific highlight of the gun violence situation.
Yeah.
So if you were approaching a conservative lawmaker about this particular issue, assuming that they had watched this conversation, do you think, how would you basically approach managing gun violence? Would you center that conversation around the responsibilities of gun owners and store owners and lawmakers? Or would you question the right to bear arms?
Well, it's a long issue, right? As you know, there's been a lot of question about what our Constitution means by the right to bear arms, right? And that the current interpretation by the Supreme Court is not the only possible interpretation. But that's aside. Right now, we're dealing with, in the near future, we're not going to get a different interpretation of this Supreme Court, and so I think that going the right of responsibilities is a good way to go. Okay, and there's a whole series of responsibilities. There's a whole series of policies. For example, most of the NRA and many gun owners refuse to even think about the thumbprint trigger. So we have all of our phones. Every single one has a phone. Has a thumbprint. You activate it with your thumbprint, and no one thinks anything of it. And yet, gun owners, with something much more dangerous than a cell phone, than an iPhone, are refusing, apparently, I'm not an expert on this, refusing apparently to even consider that we should have thumbprint triggers. A thumbprint trigger would go a ways, at least in a home, to keep from misuse of guns. And then on and on. I mean, we've seen, you see the Las Vegas situation. Here's a man who brought an arsenal, an immense arsenal of weapons, right? Much more than any gun enthusiast, than any hobbyist, than any hunter, than anyone in their right mind could justify that an individual would need as part of a right to bear arms. And no one seems to have picked it up. No one took responsibility for figuring out that this man was accumulating this immense arsenal that could only have a violent purpose. So yes, I think that we need that it's a good, it's a useful route to begin to talk about responsibilities.
I think that's a great note on which to end this evening, and please come back tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you very much.